Cavalier, didn't go to school there, so I'm a Tar Heel. And today I decided to bring a very broad picture of Europeanization of higher education, vocational training, and also science. And this is well represented by this map of scientific collaborations. So I just placed here UNC Chapel Hill and also Luxembourg, where I've been working for the last 5 years. Each of these lines is a collaboration in science. And what it shows you is basically that the entire world is producing science. And as you look at places that you're familiar with on the map, you can see how crucial the northeastern seaboard is, the European. For those of you who are interested in France, you see that everything is focused on Paris. Everybody collaborates with someone in Paris. Here, East Asia, so Japan, of course, and China. India, the outlines of India. Here, Brazil. So truly, when we're speaking of Europe, it's Europe, but also with global networks. And so I wanted to bring in that perspective of Europeanization, but also internationalization. And I'm going to do that by presenting today 2 projects that analyze institutional change in higher education in Europe and globally. And for those of you who are interested in a particular part of this, feel free to ask me in the discussion if you're interested in different vocational training models, for example, or whatever you're going to be studying. Feel free to let me know, and we can talk about more in depth about the national context. The first project that I wanted that I did on internationalization was on vocational and higher education systems and transition, the INVEST project. And the second, which is the book, I can actually also pass it around, The Century of Science, was Science, Productivity, Higher Education, R&D, and the Knowledge Society Sphere. And I want to speak a little bit about the analytic approaches that we took, the source of data. One is a big data project where we did quantitative analysis of millions of records. The other one is more of a qualitative study of policy documents, where we actually did coding of these documents. And so this exemplifies sort of the range of social scientific approaches to the study of Europeanization. And in terms of the findings, I'll emphasize Europe in a global context, and then also Europe as a model for the world, but also synthesizing some of the components of the European model in skill formation as it currently exists. So let me begin with the more global project, and that is seeing Europe as the global center of higher education and science. This project was done as a cross-cultural collaboration of investigators from China, Germany, Japan, Luxembourg, Romania, Qatar, South Korea, Taiwan, and the United States, and always in trying to utilize the knowledge of people who are from a particular cultural background, have the language facility to do analyses at a very high level. The project base was the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar, and the book, Century of Science, The Global Triumph of the Research University, tries to pull in all of these national analyses into a global picture. The second project that I'll present is Europe as a model in vocational training and higher education, and that was a cross-national investigation of Germany and France, which are, of course, very different systems, and compared with Germany, Austria, and Switzerland as similar systems, and also with the UK, the US, and the European Union. So always seeing the influential national models in vocational training and higher education and their interaction. Michelle and Megan have already spoken a little bit about policy learning, the importance of really understanding the national context, the institutions in the national context, on how difficult it is actually to just pick out a reform or a piece of a system and implant it into another. So there are real challenges of policy learning, but of course we really want to be inspired by other systems and learn from other systems. So that's really the central focus of this project. That was done at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin für Sozialforschung, and I'm currently writing a book called Atlantic Transfer, Models in Higher Education and Vocational Training in Europe and the US, where I try to systematize what we can learn from different influential national models, but also especially this growing or emergent European model. So let me start with Sphere and talk more about how we actually tried to do this cross-national investigation of the influence of higher education models and higher education expansion on scientific knowledge production. So what we really, the first piece of this was really to show the incredible expansion of the university and higher education. And we can show this because our analysis had an extensive historical scope. We looked at the entire 20th century, and it was comparative on multiple levels, so at the national level, but also in terms of the higher education systems. We measure science production on the basis of peer-reviewed research articles in science and technology disciplines and health, so that's STEM+. And as many of you probably know, I mean, a university like the University of North Carolina is is driven significantly also by medical faculty, medical school, and teaching hospitals. So that's a really important component of this. We identify factors driving this worldwide rise of science, responsible for both global similarities and national differences. And really, this Sphere project was a global project. And we are asking the question of the global triumph of the research university. So the puzzle we're aiming to put together, and the research questions are that most nations have established research universities to educate scientists and professionals and to foster social and economic innovation. Higher education is seen globally as a panacea. It's a source of social integration, of economic development, and scientific advance. And it's the main pathway to elite status, but also, and this is always important to remember these different motives, there is a human right to inclusive education, and that is extended now to higher education. So the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities says that throughout the life course, one should have access to higher education. So higher education is really a very important area, institution to study, because we have so many goals that we can only reach via higher education, or we hope to reach via higher education. In this project, we were looking mainly at its contribution to science production, and we asked the question, are there limits to growth? Is there global convergence in higher education and science? How did the European research university model evolve over the 20th century? So I studied at the Humboldt University, which is seen as one of the major, as the birthplace of the model of the research university. And so any of you who are going to be going to Germany, those of you in the TAM program, Germany really was the source for much innovation in higher education. And I'll talk a bit more about that. So in different world regions, we have national cases, and they represent a range of phases of university development. So Germany is the birthplace of the original research university, and we compared then Germany with France, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and Luxembourg as other countries that have more recently invested in the research university. Of course, North America is the currently dominant global model for higher education. A university like UNC is part of that, is very much an exemplar of what the university can, how it can perform, how it can develop, and other countries want to copy, of course, those successes. In East Asia, we have countries like Japan after the Second World War, China, Taiwan, South Korea since the 1980s, who have also taken these German and American models and are really trying to follow the successes that we find in, let's say, Germany and the US. And most recently, and this project was funded by the Qatar National Research Fund, we have countries like Qatar, but also Luxembourg, who are investing in the research university relatively late, so very recently. And they're borrowing, they're rapidly expanding, seeking innovation. And so it's interesting that now really the whole world is investing in higher education. So how do we actually do this research? Well, we have an approach as comparative institutional analysis of higher education and science development. We look at some factors such as research governance, R&D policies, investments in science, organizational fields and forms, so we're looking at research universities and research institutes, industry also investing in scientific development. Of course, being here in Research Triangle Park, in the Research Triangle, we know how important it is industry higher education collaboration. So we paired that more institutional analysis with a quantitative analysis of scientific output, and we used peer-reviewed journal articles as our measure. We bought the raw data from Thomson Reuters Web of Science. I don't know how many of you have already used citation indices for doing your research in your papers, but the Web of Science is one of the major sources for bibliographic data. We took a random sample of journals up to 1975, and thereafter we have the full data set. So we have 5-year intervals, 22 years, thousands of journals, millions of articles. As I mentioned, this is really big data, and we're trying to understand how much we can use these large data sets to understand the development of higher education and science. Some of the variables we have are the authors, the organization types, the countries, the disciplines, and we're very, very interested in the collaborations. As I showed you in that first slide, the rise of collaboration is very important, and the networks that you have are very, very important for the types of collaborations that develop, whether that's learning together, learning from people from other countries and other cultures, or really doing the research. And we look at the collaborations across disciplines, organizational forms, organizations, and countries. So let me talk a little bit about the results. We wanted to answer one of the major questions in bibliometry. Derek DeSola-Price was one of the founders, and he proposed this model of development. And he said that he predicted that there would be an exponential growth, but it would saturate. So this is the output of science production globally. And he was writing in the early 60s, and he thought that there would be a significant increase in science production, and that goes hand in hand, of course, with higher education expansion. But he said it's going to taper off because we don't actually, we'll satisfy the demand for science. And the other possibility would have been pure exponential growth, where you have an asymptotic increase and it's simply just more and more science. And we really wanted to answer this question. So working now from our perspective with this long historical data we have, we can answer this question. So what did we find? We found dramatically a pure exponential growth in science. This is the curve of global production. And we're actually calling this, especially since the year 2000, we call this global megascience, because we now have well over 1 million SCIE publications per year. So every year. This is simply impossible for anyone in any discipline to really gauge the developments in science. The growth rate from 1980 to 2011 was 3.5% a year. And we have some mega trends that are driving this. Educational expansion, scientization, competition, but also collaboration. So of course we're competing. Universities are competing, we as researchers are competing, but we're also collaborating more than ever. And that's sort of, for me, the positive message, is that much of our situation of competition at the micro level of the individual researcher or even individual students, you're collaborating more and more. And TAM is a very good example of how to build those cross-cultural collaborations. So, but I also want to talk about Europe, because Europe, as you saw in that first map, is really the center. And we wanted to find out exactly how this has developed, how Europe's position in the world has developed. And so in this graph, we start in 1900, and we find that the center of science in 1900 is in the middle of the Atlantic, okay, between Europe and North America. And we chart then how the development, based on the publications that have been published, it has a westward trend, right, reaching Canada by 1940. And we said, well, now what happens after the Second World War, after the victory of the Allies over Hitler's Germany and the Axis powers? What happens in science? Well, we find that, amazingly, Europe recovers very quickly. And this center of gravity, this global center of gravity, comes back to Europe. And then, as the countries in East Asia start producing, I mentioned China, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea just as examples, the center of gravity moves toward the east and is pulled also a bit south. So Europe is still very much the center of science, and but of course there are other regions that are major contributors and are developing their capacity. Another way of looking at this is looking at the output in different countries per year and their growth. One thing we do find is that this rising total output is driven by a broader base of contributors. So we have a six-fold increase after 1950 in the number of countries that are contributing. So in 1900, there were 27 countries producing this research that is in this database. By 2010, it's 206 countries are producing science. The average number of papers also increases. So from 1900, where it was 416 papers per country, now to 6,262. And I've highlighted the European countries in the top 10 producers. And you can see that Germany, the UK, France, Italy, and Spain are all in the top 10. So even though we like to say the US is so dominant, or now the challenge from China, if we look at the broader picture, we see that actually there are some mid-sized countries in Europe that are incredibly productive and have very long-established, well-established higher education systems. And this is just a way of representing that. And you can see, of course, that the U.S. is actually, with 2.6% growth, is somewhat stagnating in comparison with, let's say, China with 17.6% per year. But of course, China is starting at a relatively low level. Germany, the UK, France, Italy, and Spain all have strong growth and are continuing to produce a lot of science. So I mentioned this dual perspective of competition and collaboration, and I wanted to show you exactly what I mean by that. So here, from 1900 to 2010, this is the number of the collaborations. So we can see the proportion of articles that were written collaboratively, and on the right side, the countries that contributed to the article. And you can see this incredible rise also in the collaboration. So it's a similar curve to the output. Here we have the collaborations. Now, almost a quarter of all papers are collaboratively written. So this idea of a scientist in the laboratory alone or at his or her desk writing an article is less and less the reality. It's much more about working in a team, collaborating, and also finding out what can I learn from others to push the cutting edge. The growth is driven by educational expansion, competition, this idea of the knowledge society and policymakers wanting to invest in higher education research. The collaboration from 1990 onwards is significantly the result of much more educational exchange. Of course, the dominance of English is the lingua franca, and the rise of the internet. So it's much easier for us to collaborate than it ever has been before, and that's really facilitating this global science. Just to give you some look in the different countries and their contribution, this is the number of publications per million inhabitants, and we see that the UK is leading with over 1,000 articles per million inhabitants. This is also part of the story is that the UK has a tremendous number of journals, publishing houses that publish research. Germany is second place, 900. The US and France. Korea has dramatically expanded its publications. Japan and China. So this is just another way of representing this rise of science and driven by higher education expansion. I want to talk a little bit about the major European countries because they're really significant to science. Germany has a tremendous number of research universities and has also highly institutionalized research institutes. France has research universities, but also very, very strong research institutes in the Centre National de Recherche Scientifique. So a very interesting mix of institutions and organizations. UK has basically research universities, also Belgium. So those are two countries that really invest mainly in the university and higher education as a way to produce science. Luxembourg has, by virtue of the fact that it's just recently founded its university, has a low institutionalization both of research universities and research institutes. So we can see that even within Europe, there are some considerable differences in how actually these countries contribute to global science. And one thing I want to highlight is the contribution of the university to science production has been changing over time in some countries and is very stable in others. So France has risen from 30% to 50%, that's the university proportion of science production. Germany is ultra stable, and this is very interesting for those of us who know a bit more about Germany. German policymakers have been underfunding German higher education for decades, and yet German productivity has remained stable. So basically the message is that German scientists are producing more with less. So it's a very interesting to compare France, Germany, and also in the UK. We also see a rise from half to 2/3 of British science is produced by universities. So this comparative perspective is important because we can begin to think about the national context factors that are enabling, that are facilitating countries' contribution to science globally. I'm going to skip over these more national perspective, but if you are interested in a particular country, then please, we can come back to that in the discussion. So for France, we can just say that the University of Paris is really the dominant player, but it's been split up into 14 different component parts. In Germany, we have the Max Planck Society and the Helmholtz Association that are very, very important producers, but individual universities are more important. So LMO Munich, Heidelberg, Charité Berlin, and so on. Actually, single universities produce more, are significant producers, and the institutes of the Max Planck Society, the Helmholtz Association, that's an aggregate out of 80 institutes. So very different ways of producing science in these different organizational forms. And the UK is basically a story of very strong internationalized universities, whether that's the University of London or Oxbridge and the Russell Group, very, very strong universities in Great Britain. Okay, let me give you some conclusions about this more finding Europe in the global perspective in terms of science. We see a remarkable and sustained growth of science, building primarily on expanded research capacity, and that happens mostly in research universities and institutes. We have rising global, regional, national competition, but also much more research collaboration than ever before across Europe and worldwide. In the future, we are likely to see continued expansion in most countries on the basis of collaborations, but also shifts in relative strength regionally. So clearly, as I showed you, China and a lot of the East Asian countries are going to become more and more significant players as they really invest in higher education and catch up to the longer-term institutionalized systems of Europe and North America. We are likely to see the stable or rising dominance of the organizational form of the university in science production. Germany, the UK, and France remain key producers of science. They contribute to Europe's status as the global center of gravity. And in our European case studies, we find that the most internationalized universities contribute to the highest productivity. This is at least for STEM and health. So really, the strength of your research universities is crucial to the contribution your country can make to global science. And UNC, of course, is a very good example of that research capacity that's being built over decades. So I'm actually inclined to give you a moment to ask any questions based on this part of the presentation before I switch to the other project, which was much more a qualitative study of policy documents and Europeanization. That's also, of course, related to this. But are there any questions about how we conducted the study?
Not regarding how you conducted the study, but going to the case of Germany very quickly. You mentioned that it seems that Germany is doing more with less. Do you think that there's a driving factor behind their ability to do that?
Yes, Germany is of course a very interesting case because Germany has two pillars of strength, basically. We have very strong research universities, but they're underfunded, and research institutes that are very, very well funded. And this model, one could say the policy question here is should not resources be shifted from research institutes into the universities, because they have been so productive and so important for Germany as a model for the world in terms of the university in general, and also Germany has been a leading science producer, for hundreds of years. So it's I think that policymakers in Germany really need to address this issue of how they can distribute the R&D funds. But I have to say that Germany has one of the few countries in Europe that is actually already very close to meeting the EU 2020 target of 3% GDP spent on R&D. So very few countries can do that, and Germany is really also under Chancellor Merkel, who of course herself is a scientist, physical chemist. So that's been a very good phase for German science in general, less so for the universities. And of course, German federalism plays an important role in this because the lender, the state level, is responsible for so much of higher education investment. That's why when I look at this list, you can see Munich, Heidelberg, Munich, Nuremberg, Freiburg, Tübingen. These are in the southern part of Germany, where they're a very wealthy lender that can afford to invest massively in higher education. And you have some disparities then between northern and southern Germany. But of course, there are countries, there are a lender like Bremen, where you'll be studying, that have been investing a lot in their universities, and Bremen is one of the few in northern Germany universities that has been labeled an excellence university. So, but in terms of the science output, really these very strong universities in southern Germany have been developed. Is that okay? Yes.
I'm so interested in what you're saying about the UK, because it seems like it's such a powerhouse within Europe in terms of the fellowship houses, approach, the scientific production, and maybe you're getting to this, but I know just anecdotally that so many scientists, because Brexit is coming up, it's like are being left off of a lot of these grants and projects because so much money is coming from the EU, and so other collaborators are just excluding them. So what's your prediction of what could happen there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Really, for the UK universities, Brexit is the worst possible scenario, because the British universities rely so much on attracting global talent. That's similar to the U.S. So really, even though we say it's higher education in the UK, it's actually highly globalized, right? And that's really the message is their strength has come from, especially when we look at the rise in collaboration, their strength has come from being open, and from yeah.
Just with payments, so interesting at that over the years, you have many German professors, and now the program is headed up by the team there is so international.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what will remain very significant and a boon to British science, of course, is the English language, right? That so much of publishing occurs in English, so that people still will need that. That's a huge resource, and that's also, as you say, that's been a major reason why many EU collaborations have wanted to have a British partner, just to make sure that their proposals and their papers were getting that final polish, right? And we see, of course, that the rates of publication per population, standardized by population, is not only because they're more productive, it's also there's other factors that of the publishing houses and so on. And but really, because the UK has such a collaborative model, a globally collaborative model, Brexit is a serious blow to their standing globally. And this is a huge opportunity for continental European systems, right? This is they're going to especially as they increase the English language component of their graduate training programs, which is happening throughout Europe. So it's a real chance for continental European systems to increase their internationality and also to their productivity. Yes?
Just kind of wanted to go off that
Sure.
thing. The UK, do you think that situation will increase the foothold of or prevalence of American, or Canadian, North American universities in this relationship, or even Irish communities, because that is now still an English language speaking country in the EU?
Yes, I think the benefit actually of it's ironic, right? It's about this, looking at this process in historical terms. The benefit of English as for the UK or for the US is diminishing because everyone is increasing their English language capacity and their skills. At the same time, of course, the dominance in publishing is even more English focused. So people will still want collaborators in those countries, but I think it's not so much going to be nation-based. It's more about a language question, right? So if we look at the long historical arc, if French was dominant in 19th century science, then there was German, and then after the First World War, then English becomes more and more important. And of course, then after the Second World War, with the extraordinary rise of the U.S. capacity in higher education, then it's English globally. And of course, I was presenting work on STEM, so those fields have always, those natural science fields have always been more international and more oriented to English language publications and to research articles. Humanities and social sciences are much more tied to their cultural context, much more important, the comparative measure. Yeah, no.
Sure. And I know your central question was really about productivity and output of research, but in the data, did you all investigate at all the sources of funding and how that might be connected, like public versus private, whether or not some research funds come from industry or government? Because I know just off the top of my head, the UK and US are a little more private, or more heavily privatized and tuition-driven, as opposed to Germany and others that are more of a social welfare, or at least supported by the state. Did you see much trend in that, or did you collect data on that?
Yeah, that's actually, we were quite surprised how little science was produced solely by industry. But then again, what we did not analyze is patent data. Okay, we looked really at the basic research. What we do find is that, and this is also what's driving this story of collaboration, we find that industry and universities do a lot of collaborating. So it's very hard to then say what is the industry contribution versus the university contribution, because it's about collaboration and working together. So yes, industry is of course very significant, especially in the laboratory sciences, to even provide the capacity to do that kind of research. But it's often really crossing organizational form boundaries, and that's very interesting because we often try to think we can ascribe productivity to a certain type of researcher or a certain type of organization. That's no longer the case. And I think the research triangle is a very good example of exactly how that kind of synergies across organizational form boundaries occurs. As I was saying earlier, I think policymakers need to be aware that the core of your science production is coming in all the countries that we studied from the research university. So if you're not funding research university at the level that you should be, that's got to come from the state. You're putting your system at a disadvantage. And so whether you have tuition fee based higher education or not, you really have to the research university and how it's funded and how it's maintained is really the crucial question. And the U.S. has been very, very lucky that it has multiple sources of financing. That's what's really been able to driving the diversity in American higher education is extraordinary. That's enabled the U.S. to become so dominant in science. Yeah. Okay, so now I want to switch a little bit. So this is more the qualitative perspective, and I want to talk about the emerging European model of higher education and vocational training, and particularly, how many of you have heard of the Bologna process? Copenhagen process. Okay, so I will explain these. What you should think of is a pan-continental process of standardization. Trying to, these are attempts of Europe to learn from each other. And I'll explain that more in the next few minutes, but maybe as a visualization. So in 1998, the 800th anniversary of the Sorbonne University in Paris, some national ministers of higher education got together and they said, listen, we really need to, how can we ensure the success of our universities in the future? And they came up with the Sorbonne Declaration, and this is a word cloud, which shows you some of the key words that were used in that declaration. So European education, students, countries, degrees, recognition, international mobility, really attempting to think about not the individual organization, but really European higher education. How can we facilitate also mobility among the countries and transfer of knowledge in Europe? Then, if we think about European vocational education and training, in 2002, the Copenhagen Declaration was signed by national ministers. And here we have a slightly different focus. Here it's about training, development, cooperation, qualifications, the social partners, frameworks, very much a bit of a different focus, also related to the fact that vocational education and training is always tied to work, tied to professional development, right? But these are really parallel processes in Europe to think about how can we standardize, how can we ensure quality in our systems. Our research questions in this project were, we know that higher education and vocational training are viewed as solutions to societal, political, and economic challenges, reflected in the Lisbon Agenda, and specifically in the Bologna and Copenhagen processes. So in this era of Europeanization, how is the relationship between higher education and vocational training changing? We analyzed the themes of the Bologna and Copenhagen processes together, and we wanted to know, what does this emerging European model propose? Because we found that elements of Bologna and Copenhagen as European standardization was known, but there were lots of things that were ascribed to these processes, and we said, well, let's do the research. Let's find out actually what this European model consists of. So, there are processes of international standardization. We have the influence of Europe on EU member states and also globally. This is clearly an example of soft governance, the open method of coordination, so national governments trying to send their representatives to Brussels to coordinate how best to reform their systems. This is based significantly on comparative mechanisms, so whether that's benchmarking, best practices or rankings. All of these are comparative mechanisms that, especially in the context of Europe, where you have dozens of countries, is very important to gauge developments. The Bologna process since 1998-99 now involves 47 countries. The focus has been on educational mobility, so of course educational exchange, very, very crucial. The construction of a European higher education area. Here, standards, recognition, and accreditation are important. And in the parallel process in Copenhagen, the Copenhagen process, there are 32 countries. Here the focus is on employability, the European Qualification framework, which is a classification of knowledge, competencies, and skills. So you can see it's somehow similar, but there are also some differences. I will talk about some of those similarities and differences. Our approach was one of sociological neo-institutionalism, where we analyzed 3 dimensions or pillars of institutions. One is the cultural cognitive. Here we're interested in ideas and values. The normative, norms and standards, here especially professions and organizations. And the regulative, policies and regulations. So this is one way of dividing up this very complex notion of an institution, right? Our method was a theory-guided qualitative content analysis. So here we're really not interested in numbers. There's no big data here to analyze, very little quantitative data. It's more about actually the ideas, the principles that are codified in these European policy documents. We had a large set of categories that we generated with corresponding text passages. So in each process, we had about 3,000 text blocks that we used for the analysis. So here are the documents we used. So the Sorbonne Declaration, Bologna, Prague, Berlin, Bergen, London, Leuven, Louvain-la-Neuve, Budapest, Vienna. So of course, how do we do this in Europe, right? We have our national ministers meeting in different European capital cities or cities to discuss the future of the systems and how to maintain these processes. Copenhagen a similar way, Copenhagen, Maastricht, Helsinki, Bordeaux, and the Education 2020 framework. So these are recurring meetings that occur where in the English language a consensus is achieved about how the future of the system or how the system should be reformed. And our findings are always portrayed in this graphical form, where on the left-hand side you have higher education, on the right-hand side you have vocational education and training. And we were really interested to know, in terms of the cultural cognitive elements, what are the key European ideals and goals in higher education and vocational education and training. So this is somehow always comparative, higher education and VET. We see very clearly that the key ideals driving both the Bologna and Copenhagen processes are this idea of lifelong learning, the questions of economic utility, and the improvement of quality or the attractiveness of our systems. So whether it's higher education or vocational training, we want to improve, and we want to support our citizens to have access to lifelong learning. We were very surprised because so much of the dialogue and debate about Europe has been about mobility, spatial mobility across borders, and so on. It was actually only the 4th major topic in these processes. Issues of comparability and mutual recognition were important also. The social dimension was not given that much importance, so questions of inequality and this idea was actually, we found, somewhat less important than we expected. There, of course, given that these documents refer always to a process, we had acceleration or continuity of the process was a very important aspect. International cooperation, the construction of the EHEA, the European Higher Education Area, or the European VET area, was also discussed, but more in higher education. And then, as I was just presenting about science, science was only related to higher education, which I think is a very interesting finding, because of course we would expect that, especially Noel's question about industry and collaborations, why should that not be an issue for VET, right? Especially given that many countries have polytechnics or universities that are devoted to applied sciences that are also producing science also in collaboration with industry. So very interesting that that goal or that ideal was not really in the Copenhagen process. So this is sort of the cultural cognitive, but we also wanted to know not only about the ideas, but how is this legitimated? What are the arguments that are driving these processes, right? It's a very difficult thing to analyze. And so we decided that we would focus on try to find out what is motivating these processes. So here we have the legitimation arguments, we named them, and quite clearly, I mentioned in the SPHERE project we were talking about the knowledge society, right? Well, here we find it in the policy documents. Structural change is the major rationale, the major argument why we should be reforming higher education and vocational training systems, because we have structural change in the economy, because of the idea of the knowledge society, general structural changes, and that's regardless of whether it's higher education and vocational training, but we see a very interesting difference. You can see that this fourth bar from the top, vocational education and training, it's all about labor market shifts. It's about concrete jobs, occupations, right? Higher education, even though it prepares everyone also for jobs, is much more in this abstract idea of the knowledge society. Yeah, much less proximal to really a job or an occupation. Global competition is important for both. Labor market demands or skill needs. We also find some interesting issues that we were surprised to find. This was the issue of sustainability. That was very important. Social cohesion, less than equality, was more mentioned in vocational education and training than higher education. Technological developments and innovation, pretty balanced between the two. Then a few lesser legitimation arguments: democratization or stabilization, EU enlargement, of course, very important in the later period, and demographic change. So really a wide range of rationales or legitimation for why you would want to standardize European higher education and vocational training. And that is also, I think, why these processes have been so successful, because there are many different reasons why you would do that, and national ministers are encouraging each other in this process, ongoing process, to maintain this and to keep going. Then we come to the normative element of standards. Clearly, it's about quality assurance system. We have in higher education the issue of the 3-cycle structure, so bachelor's, master's, and PhD, which Germany, for example, didn't have. They had a diploma and a doctorate. That was a major challenge for Germany, but France had already had a 3-cycle system, so for them it was not, for that country it wasn't that difficult to implement the Bologna standards. We have the recognition system of higher education degrees, which is very important, also for all of you who are going to be studying in Europe. We have the development of qualification frameworks and ECTS points, learning outcome orientation, the recognition and validation of prior learning, and guidance systems. So you can see a variety of standards that are put into place, and actually this is the element that is most interesting now for the US, learning from Europe, is in this tuning learning outcomes, of trying to devise ways of standardizing across this incredible diverse group of American universities. What have people learned, right? Very difficult to measure that, and that's a challenge for all higher education systems today. And I come to the final element, that final dimension of an institution, here about European policies, and I cannot even give you a bar chart because it talked so little about the actual policies. Why is that? Imagine getting 47 countries' policymakers on the same page about policy reform goals, right? And about how they're actually going to do it. Very difficult. What we found is just a few hints about how countries should be reforming their policies. In higher education, we saw decentralized higher education administration. That means that there should, with differing degrees of autonomy, so that actually universities should be giving a lot of leeway to respond to these challenges. But, and this is important, also thinking about the privatization and marketization of higher education globally, state sponsorship should be maintained. This is clearly the continental European countries saying, wait a minute, higher education is a public good. We should be investing in that with taxpayers' money. And I'll give you a good example. So in Luxembourg, the university, regardless of your nationality, a tuition fee is 250 euros a semester, regardless of where you come from. So anybody in the world can come to Luxembourg and study there for 250 euros a semester. Please come. We have more and more classes in English. I run a master's program on social and educational sciences. It's totally in English, research-based, 2-year program, cost to the student a couple thousand euros. Of course, you have to live in Luxembourg, which is expensive, but anyway. The Copenhagen process, the regulative elements there were a range of stakeholders should be involved, especially the social partners. So that means firms and trade unions together. That's corporatism. I don't know if any of you have come across that, but corporatism is very important in explaining also collaboration, industry, and collaboration in providing vocational education training. We should have varying degrees of firm involvement because the systems are very different. In some countries, like in France, it's much more of a school-based vocational education and training. In Germany, of course, the firm is very important, and apprentices spend half their time in the firm and half their time in the school, and that alternates during the week. So it's very interlocked learning. In both cases, Bologna and Copenhagen, individual entrepreneurialism is important, and firms should invest in skill formation. So that's basically the European model. Let me just synthesize that for you. So the idea is to produce knowledgeable and capable individuals who assume responsibility for their own destiny. The European model says that young adults should be educated in globally competitive universities and/or in the workforce, in the workplace. Individuals should continue learning and react flexibly to labor market demands. This is more the neoliberal view, or the individuals responsible for their own learning. That's also, we see that emphasis in lifelong learning. And higher education and vocational education training systems should be reformed. The European model offers a template and is an international argument. So you can say, oh, well, in Europe they're doing such and such. And whether that's in Latin America or in the US or in Asia, countries, regional and regions are now arguing that they need to do similar kinds of reforms. So the European model becomes an international argument. And this brings us, of course, to the question of policy transfer, because the ambitious goals and standards codified in the twin Bologna and Copenhagen processes offer a new model to compete internationally. The European model is something new. It combines elements of different national sources. We can speak of a bricolage here. They exhibit new modes of governance. But as I showed you, Bologna and Copenhagen are primarily cultural, cognitive, and normative. They're not coercive. You don't have to, there's very little regulation involved. Dozens of countries now seek to implement these principles, including the US, and this leads to further transfer processes. So when we're thinking about transfer, we have to remember that there are some countries, we talked a lot about the Anglophone world, from certain contexts, it's easier to transfer a policy than from others. And what I've done here is, this will be the last content-based slide. So here is, I have the dimensions of, and I've portrayed the European model in comparison to the influential national models. So Germany, the UK, the US, and France have been really the leaders in both higher education and vocational training that have been looked to globally. And so here always, again, the dimensions, and then higher education or VET as different sectors. The European models connects research and teaching, emphasizes individual competencies and labor market flexibility, and that European model in this dimension is similar in the first instance, in terms of the research and teaching, to the German Humboldtian university model. But when we talk about the individual and labor market flexibility, it's much more of a UK-US kind of model. Okay. Also, in terms of lifelong learning, that's much more a US, similar to the US or France. In terms of the target groups for higher education, clearly, it's a meritocratic model. Okay, and this is related to or similar to France and the US. But in terms of vocational education, the European model says everyone should have access to vocational training, but especially disadvantaged persons. When it's all about inclusive VET, that's very much the German model, because basically everyone can have access to some kind of vocational training in Germany. But when it's talking about a program that is a program for disadvantaged persons, it's much more the French, the UK, or the US, where apprenticeships are seen as something that's kind of stigmatized. It's for a very small group of people, not very attractive. In terms of the organizational forms, we have competing universities in 3 cycles, the BA, MA, and PhD, and that's analogous to the French and the Anglophone systems. Workplace-based learning, praxis orientation is clearly German. And in terms of the regulative dimension, as I said, we have decentralized systems that should be publicly financed, and the decentralization is typical of federalism. That's the US and Germany, and publicly financed is the continental European welfare states of Germany and France. And in terms of VET, it's very much a corporatist model, which is very similar to the German, German vocational education training system is probably the most sought after, or the most lauded globally. I'll skip over the effects of Europeanization, and let me come now to my final discussion of Europeanization, the European model, and we have to admit, partial convergence. Right? If you only read the policy documents, you think these things might be that the European countries are converging because they're agreeing consensually to certain standards and certain ideals. But of course, the reality on the ground is much different, and it's much more difficult to implement these complex reforms. So, on the one hand, we can say that Europeanization promotes learning from others, but there's complex feedback, and that's both bottom-up and top-down diffusion. It gets much more complicated once you start looking into the black box of the countries. The effects of the European model are limited by endogenous elements, so your national context, and path-dependent incremental change. It's never the case that in education and training you have a tabula rasa where you're starting from scratch. It's always, there's complex institutional arrangements that have been set up over decades or centuries, and you have to deal with those kinds of existing institutions. Europeanization reconfigures the relationship between vocational education training and higher education, especially for those countries with a division between these organizational fields. So the German-speaking countries have a split vocational education and higher education. And for them, this is Europeanization is a real challenge. We have partial but often superficial convergence, and it's not coercive, but rather mimetic or normative isomorphism across Europe. So we have a lot of diffusion of ideas and standards, but less of the actual policy or governance. So, thank you very much.